Let's start off with the principles of faith. And I want to start off with what happened in Galatians, because it starts forming the whole principle that Paul was about. In Galatians 1, verse 6 to 9, the things happened that led up to the Acts 15 meeting. I am astounded that you are so quick to remove yourselves from me, the one who called you by the Messiah's grace, and turn to some other supposedly good news, which is not good news at all. What is really happening is that certain people are pestering you and trying to pervert the genuine good news of the Messiah. But even if we, for that matter, an angel from heaven were to announce to you some so-called good news, contrary to the good news we did announce to you, let him be under a curse forever. We said it before, and I say it again. If anyone announces good news contrary to what you received, let him be under a curse forever. There is something that Paul is saying here that needs a little bit of clarification. He's talking to people who are bringing another sort of good news, which he says is not good news at all. And he says those people are pestering you and trying to pervert the good news of the Messiah. Obviously, when we get to this a bit further, these people were telling them that they needed to adhere to the whole Torah and that they should be circumcised. But obviously, this is what is objecting to. Even if we, or for that matter, an angel from heaven, were to announce to you some so-called good news, an angel from heaven, one needs to understand that he is actually speaking into the synagogue situation here. Because in the synagogue, there is a person by the name of the Chazan. And the role of the Chazan is he is the chairman of the synagogue. And the Chazan of the synagogue is also known as the angel of the synagogue. So in a specific way, he's actually saying that the synagogue is coming to you and trying to give you another good news, which is different from the good news that I gave you. And he's therefore speaking about the good news that is so-called from the synagogue. This contrary good news, he actually considers to be a total curse. And he, in his way of speaking, is actually saying that it is a total curse and that one needs to stay away from it completely. In Galatians 2, verses 1 to 5, he says, "Then after 14 years, I again went up to Jerusalem, to the city of the inheritance of perfection, because the word shalom, from which the shalom is derived, actually means perfection in every area of your life. May you be complete in everything in your life." So this is perfect prosperity, perfect health, perfect peace, perfect anything that you can think is included in the word shalom. And this time with Barabbas, and I took with me Titus. Now this name Barnabas is an interesting name because this is the Hebrew name Barabbas for Barabbas. And Bar means son and Abba means father. So he took with him the son of the father. I went in obedience to a revelation, and I explained to them the good news as I proclaim it among the Gentiles. But privately, to the acknowledged leaders, I did this out of concern that my current or previous work might not have been in vain. Paul is actually talking to the situation that he explains elsewhere, that the gospel was preached to him by Yeshua HaMashiach himself, and that he had learnt it from him, and that what he had learnt from Yeshua, he was preaching to the Gentiles. So 14 years later, and obviously this is immediately after this conflict where people said that this is an incorrect gospel, he went to these leaders privately, and he did this out of concern that he might have been spreading a false gospel. So you see that Paul, as a Pharisee, was very concerned that what he was teaching had to be absolutely correct. And therefore he went to Jerusalem, and he makes the point of saying that he took with him Titus. And then he says, but they didn't force my Gentile companion Titus to undergo Brit Milah. Brit Milah is circumcision. So he's saying, I went there, and they didn't say that circumcision was necessary because they left Titus alone. And this implies that they knew that Titus had not been circumcised. So he's starting to build up a case for the Galatians to understand that even if the synagogue tells you another story, this is not the truth. Indeed, the question came up only because some men who pretended to be brothers had been sneaked in. They came in surreptitiously to spy out the freedom we have in the Messiah Yeshua so that they might enslave us. Now, Paul's idea of enslavement is being enslaved to the law. And his idea of freedom is the freedom that the Spirit has to interpret the law. So the enslavement to the law is very much where the synagogue is. And therefore, once again, he's making the comment here that the synagogue had come in to try and spy on them and was trying to take away the Gentiles who had converted to becoming believers in the Messiah. Not even for a minute did we give in to them so that the truth of the good news might be preserved to you. So he did not give in to this at all, because the truth of the good news had to be preserved. So he was saying that, well, there is those who are already circumcised, and what can we do about that? But here I took this guy who had not been circumcised to them in Jerusalem, in the city of the inheritance of perfection, and they did nothing. Paul is also acting in terms of something else. The other principle that he's acting upon is that the law goes out from Jerusalem. And therefore, to go and find out the truth, he had to return to Jerusalem, which actually also was where he studied under Gamaliel. An interesting thing about Gamaliel got up in the Sanhedrin, and he said when Peter and John were being judged there, he said that they should not do anything about Peter and John, but should leave them go. Because if what they were preaching was from God, they would not be able to suppress it at all. But if it was not from God, they would be able to suppress it. Just to remind you that Paul came from very solid teaching stock. And the solid teaching stock that he came from said that one should continuously give attention to the truth. What the Messiah has freed us for is freedom. Therefore stand firm and don't let yourselves be tied up again to a yoke of slavery, a slavery to the Torah. Mark my words, I will tell you that if you undergo Brit Milah, circumcision, the Messiah will be of no advantage to you at all. Again, I warn you, any man who undergoes Brit Milah is obligated to observe the entire Torah, because you actually become a Jew through that circumcision. You who are trying to be declared righteous by God through legalism have severed yourselves from the Messiah. You have fallen away from God's grace. For it is by the power of the Ruach, the Spirit, who works in us, because we trust and are faithful, that we confidently expect our hope of attaining righteousness to be fulfilled. When we are united with the Messiah Yeshua, neither being circumcised nor being uncircumcised matters. What matters is trusting faithfulness, expressing itself through love. In another place, he says that the entire Torah is love. All of the law is love. So this trusting faithfulness must express itself through love. And when it does not express itself through love, there is no freedom anymore. And he's saying, you're going through this process of having yourself circumcised. That obligates you to observe the entire Torah. Because this observation of the Torah that you're adhering to is actually returning to legalism, which by manner of speaking is returning you to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So he's freed us for freedom, and we need to stand firm, not to be tied up again. So this freedom that we have is the freedom that comes through the Spirit, because the Spirit teaches us to live in love, in loving kindness and in compassion, and not to be tied up again in a yoke of slavery. Mark my words that Messiah will be of no use to you whatsoever if you have yourselves circumcised again. And you will have severed yourselves from the Messiah through legalism. And legalism is the way by which the synagogue approaches the scriptures. And unfortunately, it is a big problem to this day. For it is by the power of the Ruach who works in us, because we trust and are faithful, that we confidently expect our hope of attaining righteousness to be fulfilled. He says righteousness comes as a result of the power of the Spirit. And it comes because we trust that the voice that we hear is that of the Spirit. And when we are faithful to that, he actually leads us away from sin and leads us into righteousness. So these are the things by which he moves us away. For it is by the power of the Spirit who works in us that we trust and are faithful. And this actually talks into the whole issue of what was Abram's faith. Because by the power of the Spirit he trusted, and it was reckoned him to righteousness. So Paul is alluding to Abram when he starts saying this. He says that Abram's trust caused him to be faithful. And through that trust, that the power of the Spirit working in us is telling us what we need to know, we then attain righteousness. So this righteousness is not earned, because it is the Spirit who is building it in us for the Messiah. For when we are united with the Messiah Yeshua, neither being circumcised nor being uncircumcised matters. What matters is trusting faithfulness expressing itself through love. Colossians 2, verses 16 to 23. Do not let anyone pass judgment on you in connection with eating and drinking, or in regard to a Jewish festival, or Rosh Chodesh, new moon, or a Shabbat. These are shadows of things that are coming, but the body is of Messiah. Because when you listen to the Sabbaths and the feasts, according to the exposition of the Jewish synagogue, they will tell you all about a lot of other things, but they will not illustrate to you from the Torah that the complete message of the Torah is Messiah. And if the Torah says anything that is not Messiah, that must be ignored, because it will be incorrect interpretation. There are shadows of things that are coming. So shadows of things that are coming, it actually says that the feasts particularly, but also the Sabbath, has a power to predict the future. In other words, to bring prophecy to us. And then he says, don't let anyone deny you the prize by insisting that you engage in self-mortification or angel worship. Such people are always going on about some vision they've had, and they vainly puff themselves up by their worldly outlook. So he's saying, be careful when people come and tell you all sorts of fancy stuff that might sound as though it comes exactly from the Messiah, because it is not that. It is only self-mortification and angel worship. So it has no effect at all on what you do. They fail to hold to the head. So they fail to hold on to Yeshua, from whom the whole body, having received supply and being held together by its joints and ligaments, grows as Elohim makes it grow. The entire growth comes from the Messiah. If along with Mashiach you died to the elemental spirits of the world, then why, as if you still belong to the world, are you letting yourselves be bothered by its rules? Don't touch this, don't eat this, don't handle this. In other words, when the Torah starts becoming a set of rules that you have to keep, he's saying this is worthless. This is not telling you anything about the Messiah, because such prohibitions are concerned with things that are meant to perish by being used, and they are based on man-made rules and teachings. He's drawing this directly back to the synagogue, and he's saying all of these prohibitions that tell you all of this stuff is actually drawing you back into legalism. And they indeed do have the outward appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed religious observances, false humility and asceticism, but they have no value at all in restraining people from indulging their old nature. This word old nature that is here is quite interesting, because it is flesh, and that word is sarx. And eventually that word sarx is a dead body, a carnal dead body. So Paul says that anyone who is not of the faith is actually a dead body. As you can see, I hope you can see this small print from the Greek that I put up there for you. Paul is quite clear about what is on and what is not on. But it's also important to see what he is not saying. He's saying, don't have anyone pass judgment on you because of these things. Because it's not the celebration of the feasts. It's not the eating and the drinking that tells you anything about Messiah. It is the meaning of these things that is of importance to you, and you should be adhering to those very, very carefully. In the process, he's saying that Messiah takes his entire body and he matures it. He matures it in righteousness and in growth away from sin, so that there will be no indulging of the old nature, but that where we will be going is that we will be moving in the direction of a true righteousness. A true righteousness that does not acknowledge the possibility that we are allowed to continue to sin, so that grace will become more. And this is all according to man-made rules and teachings. Now, what he's alluding to here is when one reads the Torah and the Spirit is not in you, you're not going to see the true meaning of what is written in the Torah, because you will be adhering to a lot of outward teachings and you will not be understanding the inward content. And that is what Paul is spending a lot of time on over here. So let us go and inquire Yeshua about exactly the same issue. When some Prushim and Torah teachers from Jerusalem came to Yeshua and asked him, why is it that your Talmudim break the tradition of the elders? They don't do Ntilat Yadayim before they eat. Ntilat Yadayim is not purely washing of hands. And it is written because it is meant to make you understand, why do you not do a ceremonial washing of the hands before you eat? This doesn't say you mustn't wash your hands before you eat, because he is doing this for a very specific reason. When he starts answering, he says, when they do in Tilat Yadayim, they pray a prayer. And the prayer that they pray is the following. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, good understanding to all who do them. This them alludes to the fear of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, because if you fear Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, you will actually keep the commands. And he starts immediately talking directly into that prayer by saying, why are you breaking the command of God by your tradition? Because the command of God, what I now referred to, refers to one of the Psalms and is also written in either the book of Proverbs or in the Wisdom of Solomon. I'm not quite sure, but I think it's in Proverbs. And then he says, for God said, honor your father and mother. So this is a law. This, honor your father and your mother, is a law. And anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death. So he's saying, now you go and you say to your father and mother, what I have promised to give to God, what I might have used to help you. This is how it is stated here, that what I might have used to help you, but in reality, it actually has one of two meanings. Either these guys were not honoring their fathers and mothers, or they were considering what they were giving their fathers and mothers as sacrifices. And therefore, the promising that to God actually means that they're giving a sacrifice to their father and mother, and by doing that, they're disobeying the law of honoring their father and mother, which means that when father and mother become elderly, if you truly respect them, you will be taking care of them. So he's saying, you wash your hands because it is the things that the elders taught you, and you pray a prayer, but you don't listen to what you're praying because you're breaking the exact law that you're saying that you're keeping by praying that prayer. So he's saying that your washing of your hands is a useless gesture. And then he's rid of his duty to honor his father or mother. Thus, by a tradition, you make null and void the word of God. You hypocrites. Yeshua was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is useless because they teach man-made rules as if they were doctrines. So here they take this man-made rule of washing the hands, they make a declaration that they're keeping the doctrines, and they're not doing that. Then he called the crowd to him, and he said, listen and understand this. What makes a person unclean is not what goes into his mouth. Rather, what comes out of his mouth is what makes him unclean. The disciples came to him and said, do you know that the Pharisees or Prushim were offended by what you said? He replied, every plant that my Father in heaven has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. So he's saying something that actually goes directly to the root of this whole thing. He's saying that what you're eating is not what makes you unclean. It is what you're doing and what you're saying that makes you unclean. And if you're doing things that make you unclean, what does it help to eat what is clean? Actually, what is clean is not what clean food is not what this is about. So he's not cancelling the whole issue of clean food, because clean food tells you everything about what is unclean. You see, a pig has a split hoof, but it does not ruminate. Its internal condition is unclean. Its external condition is clean, and therefore it is a symbol of a hypocrite. An ostrich cannot fly. What it is outwardly belies what it is, because it cannot fly. All of the animals who have soft feet are interesting animals, because a lot of them are carnivores and a lot of them are scavengers. And this actually means that hypocrisy is not on, scavenging is not on, murdering is not on, and he's actually alluding to all of these habits of animals that they have that make the animals images of what is unclean. And therefore he says it's what comes out of you that makes you unclean. And then they're offended by that. And then he says, every plant that my plant, the Father in heaven has not planted, will be pulled up by the roots. Let them be their blind guides. When a blind man guides another blind man, both will fall in the pit. So he's saying, these people are just simply in trouble. It is very messy what they're doing. So then Peter says, explain this parable to us. So Peter immediately cottons on that what Yeshua is saying is a parable. It is not a law. So he says, don't you understand even now? Don't you see that anything that enters the mouth, that enters the stomach, anything that enters the mouth goes out into the stomach and passes out into the latrine. So he's saying it's of no value. It actually is food. That's what it is. But what comes out of your mouth is actually coming from your heart, and that is what makes a person unclean. For out of the heart come forth wicked thoughts, murder, adultery, all kinds of sexual immorality, theft, lies, slanders. These are what really makes a person unclean. But with eating without doing, Ntilat Yadayim does not make a person unclean. So eating without washing your hands ceremonially does not make you unclean. What makes you unclean is breaking the law. He is quite clear about what clean and unclean is. Be careful to note that nowhere does he say do not eat, because that simply was not in terms of what the Torah says. So Yeshua was very clear about it, and he was pointing out quite clearly what the problems were with the clean and the unclean of the Pharisees. What I'm doing in this process is to show you what Hebrew thought is. And Hebrew thought brings one to understanding things slightly differently. Obviously, there is much, much, much more depth in all of these words than this. So, Acts 15 comes about, and Paul goes to Jerusalem along with Barabbas, and they go to discuss with the people what this whole problem of the circumcision. So some of those who had come to trust were from the party of the Prushim, of the Pharisees, and they stood up and said, it is necessary to circumcise them and direct them to observe the Torah of Moshe. The emissaries and the elders met to look into this matter. One thing that is not quite that clear is that in an open meeting, this whole thing came to the fore, and then the emissaries, the sent ones, the apostles, and the elders withdrew to look into it. And after lengthy debate, Kepha, or Peter, Kepha is Hebrew for pebble, and Peter is the equivalent in Greek. Brothers, you yourselves know that a good while back Elohim chose me from among you to be the one by whose mouth the Goyim, the nation, should hear the message of the good news and come to trust. He's now referring to Cornelius. So in the process of this referral to Cornelius, he's actually saying that what he also says when he goes to Cornelius, there was a man in Caesarea named Cornelius, a Roman army officer and the Italian regiment. He was a God-fearer. And then Peter had his vision, and I'm not going to go into all of this completely. But then came all of these four-footed animals, crawling creatures and wild birds. Then a voice came to him saying, "Get up, Peter, slaughter and eat." But Peter said, "No, sir, absolutely not. I have never eaten food that was unclean or treif." Treif is unclean. The voice spoke to him a second time. "Stop treating as unclean what God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and then the sheet was immediately taken back into heaven. Peter was still puzzling over the meaning of the vision he had seen, so it didn't make any sense to him at all. When the men Cornelius had sent, having inquired for Simon's house, stood at the gate, and called out to ask if Shimon, known as Kepha, was staying there. So they came to Peter's house, Shimon, Kepha. And Shimon is an interesting name because the name means hearer. So he is the hearer, the pebble. While Kepha's mind was still on the vision, the Spirit, the Ruach, said, 3 men are looking for you. Get up, go downstairs, and have no misgivings about going with them, because I myself have sent them. So Kepha went down and said to the men, "You were looking for him. Here I am. What brings you here?" He answered, "Cornelius. He's a Roman army officer, an upright man, and a God-fearer." A God-fearer means that he was nearly a proselyte, that he was regularly going to synagogue, and that he was learning the Torah in the synagogue because it's the only place you could learn it at that time. A man highly regarded by the whole Jewish nation. And he was told by a holy angel to have you come to this house and listen to what you have to say. So Peter is now starting to interpret this differently. He's starting to say that going to an unclean house is what the meaning of the sheet is. And as he arrived at Caesarea, the day after that, Cornelius was expecting him. He had already called together his relatives and close friends, and Peter entered the house. Cornelius met him and fell prostrate at his feet. And then in Acts 10:28 he says to them, "You are well aware that for a man who is a Jew to have close association with someone who belongs to another people, or to come and visit him, is something that just isn't done. But Elohim has called me not to call any person common or unclean. So when I was summoned, I came without raising any questions. Tell me, why did you send for me?" And as you all know, the Spirit then fell on them. So this is what Peter is alluding to, or Kepha is alluding to, when he says, "By my mouth the Goyim should hear the message." Because he went to Peter's house, and then he says, "And Elohim, who knows the heart, bore them witness by giving Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, to them, just as he did to us. That is, he made no distinction between us and them, but cleansed their heart by trust." So why are you putting God to the test now by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples of the Talmudim, which neither our fathers nor we have had the strength to bear? He's now starting to refer to the loads that the rabbinic teachings load onto the Talmudim, because in Judaism they're considered to be the equal of the Torah, particularly when those interpretations come from the sages. He's starting to say what we have been taught to keep, which is too difficult for us. We must not place that yoke on their neck, but we need to put another yoke on their neck, which will help them so that they can do what they need to do. So immediately he's starting to say that there is a differentiation between believers from the nations and believers from Israel. No, it is through the love and kindness of Adonai Yeshua that we trust and are delivered, and it's the same with them. This word, the Lord, is difficult to understand from the Greek what exactly this means, because it can mean what Hebrew would term Adonai, which is the master, but it can also be Yud He Vav He. So this means that we're a little bit uncertain, but he's actually, in a certain sense, it's through the love and kindness of Yud He Vav He Yeshua that we trust and are delivered, and it's the same with them. So he's saying there's something different that is operational when we come to faith. It's the same for us and them. We go through the same process. They receive the Spirit, and we receive the Spirit. Then the whole assembly kept still as they listened to Barnabas and Shaul tell what signs and miracles Elohim had done through them among the Gentiles. There's something that is happening here that is incredibly important. And they listened to the signs and miracles. And in effect, what is happening here is because Abba, the son of the Father, and Shaul are talking about the miracles that happened through them, they are actually making the statement that the Lord has given them an authority, because if they did not have the authority, the signs and miracles would not have taken place. Now, at that stage, James in the King James, but Yaakov broke the silence and he says, "Brothers, hear what I have to say." Shimon has told in detail what Elohim first did when he began to show his concern for taking from among the Goyim a people to bear his name. And the prophets are in complete harmony with this, for it is written, "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the fallen tent of David. I will rebuild its ruins. I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek Yudevave, that is, all the Goyim who have been called by my name." Says Yudevave, who is doing these things, all this has been known for ages. Now he's saying something very special, because you know that at the inauguration of the temple, Solomon the Great, Solomon said that this will be a house of prayer for the nations. The fallen tent of David is the tabernacle that he rebuilt in the David city and that he attended regularly. The Ark of the Covenant and the Shekhinah, the presence of Elohim himself, was in that fallen tent of David. Now, the fallen tent of David actually continues in the temple that Solomon built. And he says, "I will rebuild its ruins," because the fallen tent of David doesn't really have ruins, because it was replaced by the temple. And he said he would restore it so that the rest of mankind may seek Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, that is, all the Goyim who have been called by my name, says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, who is doing these things. All this has been known for ages. So he's saying the Lord himself is restoring this temple. And by saying that, he's saying that the restoration of this temple is his restoring the temple of which both David and also Solomon spoke, of which they said that can God be housed in a building? Because the true place to house God is inside people. So why did this house of David, why did this fall And if we then interrogate the fall of the first temple, and we ask of the sages, why did the first temple fall? They say it fell because of idolatry. And idolatry is defined in the book of Deuteronomy as serving the Lord your God with ways by which the nations serve their gods. And the second is because of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality is the immorality of Ohola and Oholiba. It is the immorality, we will deal with this in a little bit. And then because of blood, and it's because Jew killed Jew and Jew hated Jew. Because Jew is supposed to love Jew and not hate Jew. So you will see why this is important in what he then says. Therefore, because of the fallen tent of David, which is being restored now, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim who are turning to Elohim. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. So here are these three things: idolatry, fornication, and blood. And there's a fourth thing here, that is what is strangled. And then they say, in the same breath, he says, these are the things they have to do. For from the earliest times, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogue every Shabbat. Because the average Jew has never been in possession of a Torah until the more modern times, because they all had to go to the synagogue to hear the Torah read from the scrolls. And this reading from the scrolls would only truly be known to those who attend the synagogue. So he's actually saying that to learn what idolatry is, what fornication is, what things strangled are, and what blood is, you will need to go to the synagogue. And then they write this letter to the nations, and this then becomes their writings to the nations to tell them what they should be doing.
Just a thought, which maybe you want to comment on. The way that the Jewish children were brought up was that from the moment you had your understanding, your intellect, you were taught the Torah, and everything was based on that.
Yes.
And what made you a Jew and a righteous person, and somebody who could claim to be of the people of Elohim, was knowing the Torah. Now
Yeah.
they come in this meeting and they say, you don't have to have any Torah knowledge at all. The Jews were basically brought up and understood that all their life they had to learn Torah, and that made them righteous and part of Abba's people. At this Acts 15, and to an extent also Acts 10 with Kepha, the message now is, you know, you don't need to know the Torah at all. There's a few basic things that you can do. Then you will receive the Ruach HaKodesh, and you can go and learn the Torah afterwards by going to the synagogue where Moshe is read. That must be impossible for the Jews to accept.
Well, this is saying more than this. It's actually saying that if you have received Ruach HaKodesh, so in you then lives God himself. So they're saying we cannot differentiate between us and you because you have God living in you. So what right do we have to say that you're any less than we are? We have this enormous knowledge, but we're now inviting you because you need to know these things. You need to know what idolatry is. You need to know what sexual immorality is. You need to know what fornication is, what it is, what it means when things are strangled, and what it means to participate of blood. So I am going to start speaking about what this means. Okay, so the rules for the nations are, in the first place, fornication. Now let's have a look at the whole issue of fornication. And if you look at Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 to 32, when Yudhevavah, your Elohim, has cut off ahead of you the nations you are entering in order to dispossess, and when you have dispossessed them and are living in their land, be careful after they have been destroyed ahead of you, not to be trapped into following them, so that you inquire after their gods and ask, how did these nations serve their gods? I want to do the same. You must not do this to Yudhevavah your Elohim, for they have done to their gods all the abominations that Yudhevavah hates. They even burn up their sons and daughters in the fire for their gods. Everything I'm commanding you, you are to take care to do. Do not add to it or subtract from it. So he's saying that to serve me, you have to do exactly what I am asking you to do. Don't go and do what the nations are doing in their service of their gods, because that is what idolatry is. This means that where would this definition of idolatry come from other than from the Torah itself? So you see, when Shaul says, do not let anyone condemn you because of what you eat or drink, or because of feasts, new moons, Sabbaths, he's actually starting to say, do not look into perverted interpretations of these things, because this is how the nations serve their gods. Let me give you an example. And a sacrifice to Yudhevavah means, if I have sinned, I take an animal to the Temple Mount. I go and I present it at the entrance to the temple. I slaughter it myself. I cut its throat after laying my hands on it. It becomes as though it is I. So I am actually slaughtering myself for my sin. I am dying to my sin. And then the flesh is handled in four ways. The one is either in a feast with other people, so it is ingested and it is then consumed, or it is consumed by fire on the altar, or it is consumed by fire outside the camp. This means that dealing with a sacrifice, as far as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is concerned, is you're dealing with your sin, the nation's sin, the priest's sin, and with your unrighteousness. And then he burns that away, and he burns it away with fire, and the fire that enters you, which is the Spirit, is meant to bring you to new life. Whilst sacrifices to the gods of the nations actually is meant to appease them. If you bring a sacrifice to God to appease him, he hates that. He wants you to return to the condition of Adam and Eve in paradise. And that is why the sacrifices are there. And then you need to understand this, that above and beyond the fact that you are dying to your own sin, that can only happen because there is someone who is dying. The true death that is taking place is the death of the animal. And that death of that animal is actually Yeshua, who is dying for your sin and for your unrighteousness. So there's this thing that then differentiates the nations from the nation of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. There's much to be said about this, but let us continue and go and have a look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel 23, verse 2 to 6. human being. There were two women, daughters of the same mother, who were whores in Egypt. Even as young girls, they were whores. There they let their breasts be caressed, and there their virgin nipples were fondled. Their names were Ahola, the older one, and Oholiba, her sister. They belonged to me, and they gave birth to sons and daughters. As for their names, Shomron is Ahola, Samaria. Jerusalem is Oholiba, Jerusalem. Even when she belonged to me, Oholah prostituted herself. She lusted after her lovers from Asher, warriors from Assyria, dressed in blue, governors, rulers, all of them good-looking young men riding on horseback. She gave herself as a whore to them, all of the elite of Asher, and she defiled herself with all the idols and everyone she lusted after. So it's not only with the people that the women were committing adultery, but it was also spiritual adultery. She did not give up the whoring she had begun in Egypt, where men had sex with her, fondled her female nipples, and flooded her with fornication. So I handed her over to her lovers, the men of Asher who lusted after her. They exposed her private parts, took her sons and daughters, put her to death with the sword, so that she became notorious among women for the judgments executed against her. Her sister, Oholiba, Jerusalem, saw this. Nevertheless, she was worse than her sister in lusting and likewise whoring. She lusted after the men of Asher, governors and rulers, warriors dressed to perfection, skilled horsemen, all of them good-looking young men. I saw that she had defiled herself. Both sisters had gone down the same path. So the southern and the northern kingdom had done exactly the same. She prostituted herself more than ever because she saw wall carvings of men depicting the Chasdim in vermilion, with sashes wrapped around their waists and flowing turbans around their heads, all of them looking like military men, the very image of Bavel, born in the land of the Chasdim, of Babylon. So he's saying that they did exactly the same. So Jerusalem and Judah did the same. So there can be no doubt about what this whoring is, and this continuing with this. Yeshua also has something to say about this, and he has that to say in Matthew 7, when he says, "You have heard what our fathers were told, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that a man," this is not a married man, "who looks at a woman even with the purpose of lusting after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." If he looks at a woman, and looking at a woman would be easier when she's beautiful, when beauty or lust are the reasons why you go after a woman, you have already committed adultery with her in your heart. This actually means that it is so terrible to Yeshua that he actually is saying that the minute that lust or when the looks of a woman are the reason why a man wants to be with her, it is a big problem because he will not create a relationship with her. The way in which he looks at a woman is sin. If your right eye makes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. Better than you lose one part of you than having the whole body thrown into Gehenna. This is usually hell, but from the writings of Hillel, the words that are used in Hillel's writings are Gehenna, which is also considered to be hell, but what is considered to be hell by Judaism is to be cut off out of the community of Israel. So when someone has committed a heinous sin, he is cut out of the community and is not able to come into the community until he has rectified that sin. And if your right hand makes you to sin. Cut it off and throw it away. So he's addressing the issue that if looking or doing, because that's what your hand is about, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Both of these are sinful, because if you do these, you will not be acceptable in the community of Israel. The third issue that we can identify as a reason why the temple fell, that comes out of the writings, and that is blood. Now, when we start addressing blood, there are very obvious things that are involved in this. The first to say about this is, let us have a look at the opposite of adultery. And the opposite of adultery is absolute fidelity. And absolute fidelity, Yeshua speaks into this as well. Again, your fathers were told, do not break your oath. But I tell you, you not to swear at all, because an oath brings you nowhere. What brings you somewhere is not your oath, but when you keep it. Just let your yes be a simple yes and your no be a simple no. Anything more than this has its origin in evil. Bringing false witness is the issue here. When he says, do not break your oath, he's saying, bringing false witness is saying anything else than yes, yes, and no, no. So this is actually absolute fidelity that Yeshua is speaking about here. And this is the final issue of what it is to walk in absolute fidelity. In other words, to walk away from adultery. Then the next issue is the issue of blood. And let us deal with the issue of blood before this. Now, the issue of blood is the opposite of love. And this is obvious from when Yeshua says that all of the blood will be wreaked. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who was killed between the porch and the altar. Between the porch and the altar is the place where sacrifices should be presented to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and is the place where a sacrifice should be slaughtered. So he's saying that all of the prophets were brought there and were sacrificed to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and therefore that is the most terrible thing that could ever have happened. He's saying that everyone who is sacrificed in the name of their faith, but who are true to me, those who were sacrificed incorrectly. Now, if we look at what is strangled, it is quite obvious from the Torah that anything that is strangled is not clean, and anyone who eats anything that is strangled is unclean until the evening. This brings it directly into the context of it being unclean. But also, just listen to it, a person who eats what is unclean until the evening. And when the sun sets, that comes to an end. So that is what I have to say about this whole issue of the principles of faith, because that is what was brought to the fore in Acts 15.